She only wanted a child. He was just an unknown millionaire, until one ordinary night spiraled completely out of control. She had buried her dreams so quietly that no one even noticed the funeral. He had everything the world could offer and felt nothing. Two strangers, one unexpected collision, and a single night so honest, so electric, so devastatingly real, that it cracked them both open in ways they never saw coming. Some stories begin with a choice. This one begins with a wound, and becomes something far more dangerous than either of them was ready for. Are you ready to find out what happens when the wrong moment finds exactly the right person? Subscribe, leave your like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. The report was a single line. Stella read it 3 times. Not because she didn't understand, she understood perfectly, that was the problem, but because some part of her kept waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something survivable. She was still standing in the fluorescent-lit hallway of the clinic when a nurse touched her arm and asked quietly if she needed to sit down. "No," she said. "I'm fine." She was not fine. Her heels, nude, low, the same pair she'd worn to her very first appointment 2 years ago, because she'd been superstitious about it, because she'd told herself they were lucky, felt suddenly wrong on her feet, like wearing a costume from a life that no longer fit. Diminished ovarian reserve. Prognosis? Poor. She folded the paper without looking at it again and tucked it into the pocket of her wool coat. Camel-colored, bought on sale last January, during a season when she'd still believed that patience was a kind of currency the universe eventually honored. She'd been wrong about that. She'd been wrong about a lot of things. Outside, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan always did, moving loudly without apology. Taxis cut each other off at the intersection. A cluster of tourists had stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk to photograph a building Stella had walked past so many times she'd stopped seeing it. Someone knocked into her shoulder and kept walking. She didn't react. She just moved, carried forward by 11 years of muscle memory, her body navigating the blocks while her mind stayed somewhere back in that hallway. She passed the coffee shop where she and Daniel used to spend Sunday mornings. He always ordered the same thing. She used to tease him about it. She didn't look at the window. The tears caught her off guard. Not on the street, not where she'd half expected them, but in the elevator of her building, alone, watching the floor numbers tick upward in silence. They didn't come dramatically. There was no sob, no sharp intake of breath, just a slow, quiet spilling, the kind that happens when the body has been holding something so long it simply releases. She wiped her face with the back of her hand before the doors opened, squared her shoulders, walked down the hallway like someone who was perfectly okay. The apartment knew she wasn't. It wasn't the mess. Stella didn't do mess, had never been able to tolerate it, even as a kid. It was the absence of mess, the careful, deliberate stillness of a space that had been waiting. The spare bedroom, still painted grey because she'd never let herself choose a color. A shelf in the hallway bare that she'd once privately decided would hold a baby monitor. And by the front door, on a small hook, she passed every single day, Daniel's keys. He'd been gone 7 months. She'd told herself she kept them there for practical reasons. She knew that wasn't true. The kitchen was the worst room. She stood in the middle of it and didn't move, didn't reach for a glass of water or turn on the stove or do any of the small, ordinary things that usually made evenings feel manageable. The refrigerator hummed its indifferent hum. Somewhere outside, a car alarm erupted and then cut itself off. Her phone buzzed against the counter, a notification from the fertility tracking app she'd downloaded 18 months ago, the one with the little calendar icons and color-coded cycles, and she watched the screen light up and go dark without touching it. Then she opened her laptop. She didn't plan what came next. Her fingers typed flights leaving JFK tonight with the same blank calm she might use to check the weather. The results loaded. She scrolled through them with her chin resting in her hand, scanning departures the way someone skims a menu when they're not actually hungry but need to order something anyway. Boston. Too close. She could practically hear it from here. Miami. Too bright. Too social. Too much expectation of enjoyment. London. No. That felt like a declaration, and she didn't have the energy for declarations. Then, Monterey, California. One layover. Departure. 11:47 p.m. She'd never been. Knew no one there. Had no hotel, no plan, no reason. She clicked purchase before the sensible part of her brain could weigh in. The packing took less than 20 minutes. She chose the smallest carry-on deliberately. Too much luggage would imply she was staying, and she wasn't ready to imply anything. 2 sweaters, headphones, the journal she'd received as a birthday gift 2 years ago, still blank, spine uncracked. The novel she'd been meaning to start since October. She moved through the apartment efficiently, not letting her eyes linger anywhere too long. She stopped at the hallway shelf. Daniel's keys sat there under the small lamp, exactly where they'd been for 7 months. Her hand hovered. She picked them up, they were lighter than she remembered, and placed them in the kitchen drawer beneath some takeout menus and a dead battery and all the other things she hadn't dealt with yet. She didn't look back. The cab smelled like synthetic pine and someone's leftover dinner. She sat with her coat still buttoned, bag between her feet, and watched the city lights blur and multiply in the wet window. Manhattan looked strange from a distance, smaller than it had any right to be. She pressed her forehead to the glass and let it be cold. She wasn't going to Monterey for anything specific. She wasn't going to heal or restart or find herself. She was skeptical of all those words now, the whole vocabulary of reinvention. She was going because the pain had no fixed address, and she was tired of being the only one standing still. The cafe had no sign on the door. That was the first thing Stella noticed, or rather the first thing after the smell, which reached her before she even touched the handle. Dark roast and something warm from the oven, cinnamon or maybe cardamom, and underneath it the faint salt and mineral sharpness of the Pacific 2 blocks away. She'd been walking for 40 minutes with no particular direction, still running on New York time, her body insisting it was mid-afternoon while the California morning offered thin light and a wind that cut right through her jacket. She pushed the door open and went in. The place had the specific comfort of somewhere that had never tried to be charming. Mismatched chairs. One wall of exposed brick gone slightly dark with age. A chalkboard menu above the counter with 3 items crossed out and 1 spelled wrong. Not curated, just lived in, the way spaces get when nobody's refreshed them in years, and somehow that becomes the whole point. A man near the far window was frowning at his phone. 2 women sat at adjacent tables with laptops open, the particular silence of people deep in work they didn't choose. One table was empty, small, tucked against the window that faced the street, with a cypress tree visible outside and, if you tilted slightly, a narrow strip of grey-blue ocean showing between the buildings. Stella sat down without deliberating. She didn't catch the look that passed between the barista and the older man restocking the pastry case. Wasn't paying attention to anything except getting her jacket off, unwinding the scarf she'd shoved into her bag at the last second, because Monterey was colder than the weather app had suggested, her hair doing something wind-related she chose to ignore. She ordered coffee and a croissant she wasn't confident she'd actually eat, then opened her journal to the first page and uncapped the pen she'd been carrying for 2 months without using. Looked at the blank page. Put the cap back on. Closed the journal. She was sitting with both hands around her mug, watching steam disappear when the door opened. She felt the shift before she registered it. A slight change in the room's attention, the way a space tilts almost imperceptibly when someone enters who people are used to reacting to. The conversation at the counter stopped mid-word. Someone stood up straighter, and then a voice came from behind her, unhurried, the kind that doesn't need volume to land. "Who's at my table?" Not a question. More like a man narrating something he already knew the outcome of. Stella turned. He was tall in a way that wasn't trying to be impressive, just was. Dark jacket over a simple shirt, no tie, the kind of clothes that looked understated until you looked closer and realized they weren't cheap at all. Mid-30s maybe. A jaw that had spent considerable time clenched, and eyes that were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not anger exactly, but not anything close to neutral either. She looked at the table, back at him. "There's no reserved sign," she said. A pause that lasted slightly too long. "There doesn't need to be." That's not really how tables work. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, nowhere near a smile, but a small, involuntary adjustment, like a man who'd just encountered a variable he hadn't accounted for. The barista had materialized nearby, hovering with the cautious energy of someone who very much did not want to be involved in whatever this was. Stella didn't move. She picked up her coffee, held it with both hands, and kept her eyes on his. "There are 4 other empty tables," she said. "I counted when I came in." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then, without a word, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What?" She actually laughed, half in disbelief. "What are you doing?" "Sitting." "You can't just—" "You said it wasn't reserved." He glanced toward the counter briefly. "My usual. And if her coffee's gone cold, whatever she was having." "My coffee is not cold." He looked at the croissant. "You haven't touched that. I'm getting to it." He said nothing, just settled back slightly, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent years in rooms where everyone else was nervous and learned to let that be their problem. "Taylor," he said after a moment. No last name, no hand extended. "I didn't ask." "No." Something almost dry in his voice. "You didn't." The wind outside had sharpened. Through the window, the cypress tree was bending in long, slow arcs, and the strip of ocean between the buildings had gone the color of old pewter. Stella watched it, not because she had anything particular to think about it, but because looking at him felt like a thing she should ration. She was aware, in a way that she found slightly annoying, that he was watching her. "You're not from here," he said. Brilliant deduction. New York. It wasn't a question either. She glanced at him. What gave it away? He considered this with more apparent seriousness than it warranted. "The way you walked in. Like the room was slightly beneath your standards, but you'd make do." He paused. "Most people coming here for the first time look a little lost. You looked irritated." "I wasn't irritated." "A little." She turned back to the window. The first drops had appeared on the glass, sliding sideways in the wind. The storm had been threatening since she'd left the hotel. Sky getting heavier, air getting that particular dense quality that meant whatever was coming was not going to be brief. "It's going to pour," she said. "Yeah," he glanced outside. "Comes fast here when it decides to." Neither of them reached for their things. She hadn't agreed to go with him. Not exactly. It had happened the way certain things do, not with a decision, but with the slow absence of one. The storm had pinned them inside the cafe longer than either had anticipated. Rain coming down hard enough to turn the windows into white noise. And somewhere between the second coffee and a conversation that kept starting as one thing and arriving somewhere else entirely, Taylor had mentioned he was driving north and there was a point on the coast she wouldn't be able to picture until she actually stood there. He'd said it the way he said most things, flatly, without sales pitch, like an observation she was free to act on or ignore. She'd told herself she was just tired of the hotel room ceiling. Highway 1 going north was the kind of road that made you feel faintly ashamed for every year you'd lived without knowing it. The asphalt ran right along the continent's edge. Ocean on the left, cliffs that simply ended without ceremony, the Pacific far below looking storm-churned and indifferent, white water exploding against rocks that had been there long enough to stop caring about the waves. Stella had her window down 2 inches despite the cold. The air smelled like salt and wet stone and something she didn't have a word for. Taylor drove with one hand. The other rested on the center console close enough to her side of the car that she was periodically involuntarily aware of it. She kept her gaze on the water. "You're quiet," he said, somewhere around the 20-minute mark. "I thought that was the point." "Of what?" "Of—" She gestured at the windshield, at all of it, the road and the cliffs and the grey enormity beyond. "You come up here to not talk, don't you?" A pause that wasn't quite agreement. "Usually alone." "I can be quiet." "I know, you have been." He glanced at her briefly. "It's just not what I expected." She turned toward him. "What did you expect?" He took a moment, not stalling, she was learning, just the habit of someone who'd stopped saying things before he'd actually finished thinking them. Questions, he said. Most people ask questions. About what? About me. Straightforward. No ego in it, just fact. She looked back out her window. I imagine that gets old. He didn't answer. But something in his shoulders changed, something subtle enough that she almost missed it. A slight release, like a word he'd decided not to say. She filed that away without knowing quite why. The turnout appeared without warning, an unmarked widening of the shoulder, a low barrier of weathered wood gone silver-grey, no sign, nothing to suggest it was worth stopping for. Taylor pulled off and got out without explanation. Stella followed, and the wind found her immediately, the kind that doesn't ease in but arrives all at once, cold and salt-heavy and completely uninterested in her jacket's limitations. Then she saw it. The cliffs dropped away hundreds of feet to water that was still angry from the storm, throwing itself against the rock base in deep, irregular pulses, less a sound than a physical presence, something she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. The horizon was a single grey line where the sky and ocean had blurred into the same thing. Above them, a large bird, a pelican maybe, or something bigger, hung suspended in the wind, with its wings completely still, not going anywhere, just held there by the air like something paused mid-thought. Stella stood at the barrier with her hair fully surrendered to the wind, and said nothing. Taylor had stopped a step behind her and slightly to her right. She was aware of him the way you're aware of a heat source, not looking, just knowing. He wasn't watching the ocean. She could feel that without turning around. Okay, she said after a while. Yeah, he said. When she turned, his expression was different from anything she'd seen in the cafe. Less composed somehow, not vulnerable exactly, more like a wall with one brick slightly out of place, and if you knew where to look, you could see the gap. She had the unsettling feeling of being observed by someone who hadn't meant to be doing it. Why did you bring me here, she said, not challenging, just actually asking. He looked at the water, then back at her, a longer pause than usual. I don't know, he said, and the simplicity of it was what made it land. 3 words that sounded, for the first time, like he hadn't prepared them. They started walking along the barrier without discussing it, the wind filling the space between sentences, which made conversation feel less like performance and more like something actual. He told her the lookout didn't appear on any map he'd ever checked. She told him she hadn't booked a return flight before leaving New York. He absorbed that without comment, which she registered as something, she wasn't sure what yet. The path narrowed where a section of the barrier had rotted and never been replaced. They adjusted without thinking about it, walking closer, shoulders making brief contact every few steps. Neither of them drifted apart. She raised her hand toward the horizon, pointing at a dark shape she couldn't quite resolve. Ship or rock formation, hard to tell from up here. He leaned in to follow the angle of her arm, his head close to hers, and his hand came to rest against the small of her back. Just for a moment, the automatic gesture of someone orienting themselves to another person's sightline, nothing deliberate about it, except his hand stayed, and she didn't step away. Container ship, he said quietly. Southbound, probably out of Portland. She said she hadn't realized they passed so close to the coast. He said everything looked closer than it was from up here. The distance played tricks, made things feel nearer than they were. She wasn't entirely sure he was still talking about the ship. When he finally moved back, neither of them said anything about what had just happened. She looked at the ship. He looked at the water. The wind kept going. And in the space where they didn't speak, something sat quietly between them. Not quite named, not quite ready to be, but real enough that they both felt the weight of it. We should probably head back, he said. It'll be dark in an hour. Probably, she said. They stayed another 10 minutes. The restaurant was small enough that you had to mean it. No name above the door, no listing on any street she'd checked, just a hand-painted number on weathered wood, set back from a lane so narrow she'd almost missed the turn. A single bulb above the entrance threw a circle of yellow light onto the wet stones below. Taylor had reserved a table without mentioning it at any point on the drive down, which meant he'd been planning this before she'd technically agreed to anything, which she filed away and chose deliberately not to open. Inside it smelled like wood smoke and browned butter and garlic, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that's been running for hours. The tables were close, not uncomfortably so, just close enough that you couldn't pretend you were anywhere other than exactly where you were, with exactly who you were with. The candle between them was already half burned, wax pooled unevenly to one side, and its light shifted with the drafts in a way that made everything feel slightly in motion. They ordered without urgency. A local wine the waiter said was worth trying. Food that took its time. For a while the conversation stayed in safe water. The drive, the container ship they'd watched from the cliff, a minor disagreement about whether the bread was sourdough that somehow lasted 10 minutes and ended without resolution. Easy. Surprisingly easy, which should have been reassuring but felt underneath like the calm before something. Then the wine found its level, and the candle burned down another inch, and the room got quieter as the other tables emptied, and something rearranged itself in the air between them, subtle, like a pressure change before rain. Not visible, just felt. "Can I ask you something?" Stella said. He looked up from his glass. "You've been not asking things since the cafe." "I was being polite." "No, you weren't." A pause. "You were deciding." She let that sit for a moment. "What do you actually do?" "I own things. That's not... It's the honest version." He turned his glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth. Not fidgeting, just something to do with his hands. "Real estate mostly, some development, a few investments that made sense when I made them." He stopped. "It stopped being interesting around 4 years ago." "Then why keep... Because I'm good at it." "No pride in it." "None. And I ran out of ideas for what else to do." The candle shifted. She watched his face in the unreliable light and thought about how much it cost a man like him to say something like that. Probably not much, technically. He'd clearly made a kind of peace with it. But there was a difference between peace and satisfaction, and she was starting to understand which one he'd actually settled for. "Your turn," he said. "Publishing. Editorial." She reached for her wine. "I find books that deserve to exist and try to convince people to care about them. You like it?" "I did." She put the glass down without drinking. "I don't know what I think about anything this year, honestly. I went through a few things, hard things. And now I have all this clarity about my life that I didn't ask for. And it turns out clarity doesn't feel the way people say it does. It's not freeing, it's just..." She shook her head slightly. "Loud." He didn't fill the pause, didn't reach for anything reassuring. Just stayed with her in it, present in a way she hadn't experienced in a conversation in longer than she wanted to calculate. So she kept going. She hadn't planned to. She hadn't planned any of this week, which was maybe the whole point. But he was listening, actually listening, not the performative kind where someone maintains eye contact while assembling their response. And the room was warm, and she was tired of carrying things she'd been carrying alone, so she told him. The years of trying, the apps and the appointments and the indignity of scheduling hope. Daniel and the way their marriage had ended, not with a fight, but with two people finally admitting they'd been building on nothing for a long time. And the clinic, the hallway, the paper with 5 words. She didn't cry. She noticed that, with something close to relief. When she finished, Taylor said nothing for a long moment. He wasn't searching for the right thing. She could see that clearly. He was just letting it land, all of it, without trying to reshape it into something easier. "I'm sorry," he said. "Just that. It's..." She started the automatic response. "It's not fine." Quiet, direct, not unkind, just unwilling to let her do that. She looked at him. Nobody ever just lets it be what it is. Everyone wants to find the angle, the silver lining, the person they know who tried something different. She stopped. "You just said it wasn't fine." "Because it isn't." The food had gone cold without either of them noticing. Later, after the plates had been cleared and a second candle appeared unrequested, and the restaurant had gone down to just them and one other couple speaking quietly near the door, she asked him what he was afraid of. She expected a deflection. He'd been so efficient with deflection all night. Instead, He went quiet long enough that she thought she'd lost him somewhere. "Staying long enough for something to matter," he said, finally. "And then leaving anyway." He looked at the table, not avoiding her, just looking somewhere neutral while he said it. "I do it. I've done it enough times to know it's a pattern. I just—" a pause. "Haven't minded enough to change it." She didn't try to fix that either, just held it the way he'd held hers. They left after midnight. The lane was empty, air sharp with eucalyptus and cold stone, their footsteps absurdly loud in the silence. His hand found hers at some point between the door and the car. No announcement, no question. Just fingers closing around hers with a certainty that felt less like a move and more like a conclusion. And she let it happen exactly as it was. The villa was 10 minutes north. He'd had it for the week, he mentioned. She'd somehow already known. At the door he stopped and looked at her, not asking, not quite. Waiting, maybe. Giving the moment the space it needed to be chosen, rather than just fallen into. The air between them had the specific weight of something irreversible. She reached past him and opened the door. The lights inside were dim, and the far wall was almost entirely glass, and through it the ocean moved in darkness. Black water, white breaks, the horizon a seam between two versions of night. They stood in that light without moving, and she thought about all the rooms she'd stood in while waiting for her life to start. This didn't feel like waiting. What came next was not an accident, and it was not reckless, and it owed very little to the wine. It was the result of days of circling something neither of them had named, and the quiet, mutual decision to stop pretending they weren't. He kissed her slowly, like he wasn't going anywhere. She stayed present in a way she hadn't managed in years, no part of her hovering at the edge, observing, keeping score. Just there, just this. When the room finally went still, and the only sounds were the ocean and his breathing, she lay looking at the ceiling with her heart doing something unfamiliar. Not grief, not longing, not the specific ache of wanting something just out of reach. Just fullness, the strange, almost forgotten weight of it. Taylor's arm lay across her, heavy and warm and completely at rest. She watched the ceiling for a long time. The light came in the way coastal light does, not arriving so much as accumulating, grey layering over grey, until the room became visible without ever becoming bright. Stella had been awake for a while. She'd slept in fragments, aware of the room between each one. The ocean had settled sometime around 4, trading its post-storm roar for something lower and more continuous, and at some point Taylor had shifted beside her, his arm moving across the sheets without him waking, and she'd gone completely still and waited. For what exactly she couldn't have said, for his breathing to even out again, for the ceiling to offer something useful. Neither did. Now she sat up slowly, transferring her weight with the careful precision of someone who has thought about this in advance. He was on his stomach, one arm reaching into the space she'd just left, face turned toward the wall. Asleep in a way that looked unguarded. The jaw she'd only ever seen clenched was loose, his shoulders absent their usual held quality. He looked younger, less like someone running a calculation. She looked at him longer than she'd intended to. Then she made herself look at the room instead, her jacket folded over the chair back, her bag on the floor packed. Still packed, she realized, the way it had been every day at the hotel too. She'd never fully opened it, hadn't hung anything up, hadn't rearranged anything. Some part of her had been maintaining a kind of low-grade readiness to leave without ever consciously deciding to. I need to go. The thought didn't announce itself. It was just there, already formed, patient, like it had been waiting for her to stop being asleep enough to receive it. It wasn't about him. That was the part she kept returning to, pressing on like a bruise. It wasn't that anything had gone wrong. The opposite, actually, which was the problem. The night had been exactly what it was, without apology or performance, and she'd told him things she hadn't told another person in full, and he'd sat with all of it like it was worth sitting with, and now morning had come, and the evidence of every bit of that was around her in this room she didn't live in, and something ancient and efficient inside her had already begun looking for the door. She recognized the feeling. She just hadn't felt it in a while. It moved faster than she remembered. In the bathroom, she ran the cold tap and leaned over the sink and looked at herself. Actually looked, the kind she usually avoided. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly and had recently felt too much. The kind of face that doesn't lie well, which had always been an inconvenience. She dried her face, pulled her hair back, did the small automatic things that make a person feel like they have a plan, even when the plan is mostly just motion. Back in the room, her shoes were where she'd left them by the door. She always left them by the door, had done it since she was a kid. Her mother used to find it strange. She sat on the edge of the chair to put them on. Taylor hadn't moved. His breathing was slow and even, the breathing of someone with no argument running in the background. She picked up her bag, stood there. She was not unaware of what she was doing. That was important. She needed to be clear with herself about that. She could have woken him, could have sat on the edge of that bed and had a real conversation, the kind where you say "I'm scared" out loud to someone who might be able to do something with that information. The option was there. It was right there. But if she stayed long enough to talk, she'd stay. And if she stayed, she'd want more of this. More of last night. More of the way he'd listened, more of the specific feeling of being seen by someone who wasn't trying to fix her, and wanting more was exactly what she'd sworn off. She'd spent 2 years wanting one specific thing with her whole body and her whole schedule, and it had still ended in a fluorescent hallway with 5 words on a piece of paper. Wanting didn't protect you from anything. It just made the eventual damage more precise. She set the key on the kitchen counter. The sound it made on the stone, small final, was louder than she expected. She didn't leave a note. She stood there for a moment, looking at the empty counter, and felt the specific weight of not leaving one. She knew what it was, she didn't dress it up, and then she walked to the door and went through it and let it close quietly behind her. Outside, the air was cold and white and tasted like fog and salt and eucalyptus. Her phone read 6:14. The rental car sat in the gravel lot coated in coastal moisture, windshield completely opaque, like even it needed a moment before facing the morning. She got in and didn't start it. Through the condensation, the villa was a soft smear of shape, a warm light still on in one of the back rooms, curtains she recognized through the blur. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched it. 4 minutes passed. She knew because she counted, not intentionally, just the way the mind fills silence with something measurable. Then she started the engine and left. The highway was nearly empty, fog so low on the water that the ocean and sky had fused into the same flat nothing, the same view as from the cliff the day before, except yesterday she hadn't been alone in front of it, and that difference was large enough that she refused to look directly at it. She was good at the redirect. Years of medical appointments had taught her the discipline of moving through a hard morning by fixing her attention on the next concrete thing: hotel, shower, coffee, get home. Her phone rang at 7:52. Taylor. Just the name, the way she'd typed it 2 days ago in the cafe parking lot. No last name because she hadn't known it yet. She watched the screen until it went dark. No voicemail. Then a text, 30 seconds later. "Where are you?" No question mark. Exactly how he talked. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat. It rang again at 8:17, then at 8:40. She didn't look at the screen the third time. She just drove, fog thinning as the road bent inland, the ocean falling away behind her. A radio station bleeding in that she hadn't chosen, something slow and piano-heavy. And she left it. She booked a flight in a gas station parking lot off the one engine running, the transaction completed in under 3 minutes. New York, that evening. One way, because apparently that was still who she was. Inside the station, a man behind the counter said morning, and she said morning, and her voice came out sounding like a person who was fine. It was both a small victory and a fairly damning piece of evidence. The coffee was too hot. She held it with both hands anyway, standing on the asphalt, watching fog drift in slow, unmotivated shapes above the road. Taylor was awake by now. She knew that the way you know things, you'd rather not. She knew exactly what he'd found. The empty half of the bed, the bag gone, the key on the counter. Because she had assembled that scene deliberately, piece by piece, and she was not interested in pretending otherwise. That was what stayed with her. Not guilt, quite. Something with more edges than guilt. The plain knowledge that she had done this consciously, with complete clarity, understanding every part of what it was, and had done it anyway. 6 weeks later, Stella was standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning holding a pregnancy test she'd bought at midnight and hadn't opened until now. She hadn't bought it believing it would be positive. She'd bought it the way you eventually take your car to the mechanic after ignoring a sound for 3 weeks. Not because you think it's serious, but because the not knowing starts to cost more than the knowing. Her body had been behaving strangely. A fatigue that sat underneath everything, unaffected by sleep. Nausea that came in without knocking and left the same way. A sensitivity to smells that had made her morning coffee, the one ritual she'd protected through 2 years of fertility treatments, through Daniel leaving, through all of it, suddenly undrinkable. She'd bought the test to confirm it was something else, stress probably, or the tail end of whatever virus had been moving through her office building. She looked at the result. 2 lines. Not ambiguous, not the kind you tilt toward the light trying to interpret. Just there, definitive, unhurried, sitting in her hand while the refrigerator hummed its usual indifferent hum, and the city outside her window started its morning without her. She didn't feel happy, she didn't feel devastated. What she felt was a sudden, total absence of signal. Like every thought she'd been running in the background had simultaneously stopped, and she was standing in the resulting silence, not knowing what to do with it. Diminished ovarian reserve. Prognosis. Poor. 2 months she'd been carrying those 5 words. 2 months of having rearranged her entire understanding of her future around them, quietly, without telling anyone how thoroughly she'd done it. And now her body had apparently not read the report. Her legs made a decision she hadn't consciously made. She sat down on the kitchen floor. The tile was cold through her pajama pants, and she didn't move, and she didn't try to think her way through it. She just sat there while the refrigerator kept humming, and a cab honked 4 floors below, and somewhere in the building above her someone's shower turned off. She'd been home from California for 6 weeks. She'd come back to her apartment, her desk, the stack of manuscripts she was 2 weeks behind on, the ordinary machinery of a life that had continued without her while she was gone. She hadn't told anyone about Monterey, not her sister who called every Sunday, not her friend Maya who would have listened without judgment, not even the therapist she'd been seeing on and off since Daniel, because she hadn't known how to categorize it yet, and she'd told herself she was waiting until she did. The real reason was simpler and less flattering. She hadn't wanted to say it out loud and make it something that required a response. She'd thought about Taylor less than she'd feared she would, more than she'd wanted to. Some days, not at all, genuinely. Other days at odd moments, while waiting for the elevator, while reading the first pages of a manuscript once inexplicably while buying groceries on a Wednesday evening. A flash of something specific and sensory, his voice or the weight of his hand, gone before she could do anything with it. She'd mostly managed. She looked at his name in her phone for a long time before she called. Just Taylor. No last name because she'd saved it in the cafe parking lot before she knew one and had never updated it. She looked at those 6 letters for what was probably 2 full minutes. Then she pressed call. 3 rings. She was already composing a voicemail in her head. "Hi, this is going to sound strange. I need to talk to you about something," when someone picked up. The voice was not his. A woman. Composed, unhurried. The specific ease of someone who was comfortable exactly where she was. "Hello? Sorry." Stella's brain stalled briefly. "I might have the wrong—" "No, this is Taylor's phone." Completely unbothered. "He's in the shower. Did you want to leave a message?" The phrase landed before Stella had time to prepare for it. He's in the shower. Not he's unavailable or he can't come to the phone. The intimate domestic shorthand of someone who knew his location because they were in the same space, who offered that information the way you only do when it's ordinary. Stella heard it the way you hear a single wrong note in a song you know well, immediately, before you've processed what's wrong. When would he be free? Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. "Honestly, today's a small laugh. Light, private, not unkind. It's our wedding day, so it's a little hectic. Can I have him call you back, or I can pass along a message?" The floor was very cold. Stella became aware that she'd stopped breathing. She made herself take a breath, deliberately like something she had to remember how to do, and looked at the wall of her kitchen, at the print she'd hung there 3 years ago that she'd stopped seeing months before that. "No," she said. Her voice was still steady. She genuinely didn't understand how. "Don't. It's nothing. I'm sorry to have bothered you." She ended the call. The phone sat in her palm. She looked at the screen the way she'd looked at the test, waiting, irrationally, for the information to change. It didn't rearrange itself, it just sat there, our wedding day. She tried to put the pieces together in an order that made sense. Taylor, who had said I stay long enough for something to matter and then leave anyway, with the flat honesty of a man confessing a pattern he'd accepted. Taylor, who had listened to her in that restaurant like she was worth slowing down for. Taylor, whose hand had found hers on a dark lane outside a restaurant in Carmel without question or ceremony. That man was right now somewhere toweling off from a shower and getting ready to marry a woman who answered his phone with the ease of someone who had every right to. The nausea she'd been managing for 2 weeks stopped being manageable. She made it to the bathroom. Afterward, she gripped the cold edge of the sink and looked at herself in the mirror, really looked, at a face that was running about 3 different expressions at once and not quite landing on any of them. She turned the tap off, went back to the kitchen. The test was still on the counter where she'd left it. Those 2 lines, steady as ever, indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 8 minutes. She looked at it from across the room and felt something in her shift, not heal, nothing as clean as that, but settle. Like the moment after an earthquake when the building is still standing and you realize it's going to hold. She crossed to the counter and picked it up. This was hers. Whatever Taylor was, whoever that woman was, whatever had happened between Carmel and that phone call, this was hers. This improbable, medically implausible fact growing inside her had nothing to do with any of it. She was not going to make her child's existence contingent on a man who was currently getting married to someone else. She was not going to wait for anything. She set the test down, filled the kettle, put it on, stood in her kitchen while the water heated and let herself feel it. All of it without editing, without the usual redirect. The shock, the grief underneath the shock, and underneath that, quieter than either. Something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Not happiness exactly. Something rawer than that. Something that didn't have a name yet because she'd stopped believing she'd need one. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. The apartment had good light. That was the thing that decided it. Not the neighborhood, not the monthly rent she'd negotiated down by $200 while 9 weeks pregnant and sitting on a folding chair in her Chicago living room. Not the proximity to the small independent press that had offered her a senior editorial position after 2 video interviews in which she'd worn a blazer over a maternity tank top she'd bought 6 weeks too early. The light was what did it. The way it came through the tall west-facing windows in the late afternoon and held the room in something golden for about 40 minutes before releasing it. Unhurried. Like the apartment had made a specific promise about what time of day would feel like here. She signed the lease on a Wednesday in January. She moved in February. Liam arrived in April. The move had been harder. She'd tell people that for years, and they'd assume she was joking. Portland didn't make a fuss about receiving her, which was exactly what she needed from it. It was a city full of people who'd come from somewhere else and rebuilt on different terms, and nobody here asked too many questions about what you'd left behind or why. She found a coffee shop 2 blocks north where the barista, a tall, unhurried woman named June, knew her order by the 3rd visit and had it started before Stella reached the counter. She found a walking path along the river, where she went most mornings through the end of her pregnancy, headphones in, pace decelerating week by week, until by March she wasn't really walking so much as being present outdoors at a slow and deliberate speed, which she counted anyway. She built a life the same way, slowly, deliberately, choosing the pieces that felt load-bearing. Rosa came from a prenatal yoga class, one of those connections that starts as logistics and becomes something else before you notice. She lived 4 streets away, had opinions on almost everything, and was right about most of it in a way that was initially irritating and then became one of Stella's favorite things about her. Marcus was a colleague at the press who brought soup twice, unrequested, just showed up with it, after Stella mentioned in passing that she'd been too tired to cook. She didn't make a big deal of it, which made her trust him more than if he had. When people asked, she said she was doing this on her own. She'd practiced saying it without the defensive undertone that invites follow-up, and mostly it worked. People nodded and moved on. The ones who pressed, who did the slow, concerned head tilt, she'd learned to redirect. She had more patience for that now than she would have had 2 years ago. She wasn't sure if that was growth or just exhaustion, settling into something resembling acceptance. What she never told anyone was the specific fear she carried through every week of the pregnancy. Not logistics, not money, though she'd run those numbers enough times to have them memorized. What she was afraid of was wanting this too much. She had spent 2 years learning in very concrete terms that desire was not a form of protection, that wanting something completely didn't make it more likely to stay. And now she was wanting the most consequential thing she'd ever wanted, and there was nowhere to set that fear down. She just carried it and kept walking and tried not to think about what it would cost her if she lost this too. Liam was born on a Tuesday in April, 3 days before he was due, in a hospital room with a window that faced east. 11 hours of labor. Rosa had stayed for all of it, sleeping in the recliner during the long, quiet middle hours, handing Stella ice chips when she needed them, and mostly saying nothing, which turned out to be exactly right. When it was over, when they put him on her chest, warm and startlingly present, already looking around with a focus that seemed excessive for someone who had been outside a body for approximately 3 minutes, Stella didn't say anything. She couldn't find anything that fit. She just held him and felt something in the architecture of herself shift, something structural she hadn't known was crooked until it straightened. He had dark eyes. She noticed immediately. She didn't let herself think about whose. The early months were hard in the ways people warn you about, and hard in the ways they don't. The 3 a.m. hours that were both endless and gone too fast. The particular loneliness of experiencing something enormous with no one to turn to in the specific moment of it. The discovery that she could run on 4 hours of sleep and still feel underneath the tiredness a kind of bedrock she didn't remember having before. She couldn't name it exactly. It was just there, steady, unargued, like something that had always been true but needed the right conditions to become visible. She went back to work in September. By November she was full-time again, and she was better at it than she'd been before, sharper somehow, less willing to waste attention on things that didn't actually matter. The manuscripts she took on that fall were the strongest acquisitions she'd made in 3 years, and she knew it without needing anyone to confirm it. She'd stopped apologizing for knowing things. She still thought about Taylor, not constantly. Less than she had in Chicago, less than she had in the early Portland months, which was a kind of progress she tracked without making too much of it. But not never. On the night of Liam's 6-month mark, she sat on the living room floor and watched him work on rolling over. The pure, concentrated effort of it, the wobble, the small, furious triumph when he got there, and how he immediately looked up at her face to see if she'd seen, and she felt something move through her that she couldn't flatten into a single word. Not longing, not resentment, something with more texture than either. The simultaneous awareness that this moment was complete, and that it was missing something, and that both of those were true, and that they'd probably always be. She'd deleted his number in February. The day she signed the lease, actually, she'd done it deliberately as a kind of private ritual, holding the phone until she found his name, and then pressing delete, and then making tea, and sitting with the view from her new window. She'd felt the loss of it more than she expected to, which told her she'd been right to do it. By the following spring, she recognized, without much drama, that she'd been keeping a door unlocked, not consciously, just not locking it. She locked it, took maybe 30 seconds, felt more permanent than the delete had. On a Saturday in October, 16 months after Carmel and 14 after Portland, she took Liam to the farmer's market in the canvas carrier she used most weekends. He faced out now, alert to absolutely everything. Pigeons, strangers, a golden retriever on a long leash that he tracked with total commitment until it disappeared from view. Stella moved through the stalls with a travel mug in one hand, her wallet in the other. Liam's weight warm and familiar against her chest. She felt for the first time she could date precisely, entirely like herself. Not becoming, not recovering, not a work in progress. Just present, solid. A woman who knew where she was and had chosen it with full information. She bought peaches that were slightly past their best window, but looked too good to leave. Liam grabbed the paper bag immediately, and she let him have it. The morning was cold and bright, and smelled like wood smoke from someone's chimney nearby. And she stood in the middle of the market with her coffee going cold, and her son examining the bag with great seriousness, and felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a life that had found a shape. Not the shape she'd designed, better, in the ways that actually hold. She started walking back toward the apartment, Liam still gripping the bag, the cold air sharp against her face. What she had no way of knowing, couldn't have known walking down that ordinary Saturday street feeling more like herself than she had in years, was that 3 weeks from that morning, in a hotel lobby in Seattle, the life she'd so carefully and quietly built would be asked to hold considerably more weight than she'd planned for. The conference was 3 days, and Stella had almost not come. The press had registered her months ago, a publishing summit, 2 panels, 1 keynote she was moderating, and she'd made all the arrangements with Rosa for Liam, packed her single carry-on the way she always did, told herself the logistics were manageable, and Seattle was only 2 hours by train, and she'd be back Thursday evening, and none of this was a big deal. She'd called Rosa 3 times before the train cleared the Portland city limits. The hotel was large and efficient, and smelled like the specific combination of fresh flowers and recirculated air that every conference hotel in every city somehow shares, designed, she'd always thought, to make everyone feel slightly interchangeable. She checked in Tuesday afternoon, rode the elevator to the 11th floor, and spent 20 minutes on a video call with Liam before Rosa said, gently but with the firmness of someone who'd done this before, that he was tired and needed dinner, and Stella needed to let him go to sleep. She put the phone down, looked at the room. Fine, it was all fine. Wednesday blurred the way conference days do. Sessions that ran long, the hallway conversations that somehow contained more substance than anything on the official schedule, a dinner she attended for exactly the right amount of time, before excusing herself without guilt. She was good at this version of herself. Focused, mobile, able to navigate rooms full of strangers with the ease of someone who'd learned to be genuinely curious about people as a professional survival skill before it became real. She slept better than she expected. Thursday morning, she was in the lobby by 8:15, 20 minutes before her keynote, wearing the dark green dress she'd bought for a book launch in September and the heels she'd almost left behind and retrieved at the last second from the floor of her closet. Laptop bag on one shoulder, coffee in her free hand, Liam in the carrier on her chest facing outward. She'd brought him down from the room rather than leave him with the hotel's babysitting service 1 minute longer than necessary. Her mind was already upstairs in the conference room, running her opening remarks in sequence, moving a section she'd decided last night was in the wrong place. She almost walked straight past him. It wasn't a sound that made her look up. It was the opposite. A sudden stillness in the lobby's ambient motion, the kind of imperceptible shift that happens when something occurs in a room before anyone has consciously processed it. She looked up from her coffee and across the wide marble floor. He was coming through the revolving door, phone to his ear, jacket that fit with the specific ease of someone who'd long stopped registering what things cost. 40 feet away, maybe less. Taylor. For one genuinely strange beat, she thought she'd constructed him, that her brain had borrowed a jaw from one stranger and a posture from another, and assembled something that wasn't there. But he kept moving, the call ending as he came through into the lobby's air, and he was real and 3-dimensional. And 16 months had done absolutely nothing to make him look like someone she wouldn't know immediately from across a room. She didn't move. He was scanning the lobby the way she remembered, that unhurried orienting sweep, the look of someone accustomed to arriving places and making them arrange themselves accordingly. His gaze traveled across the space, past her, continued 2 or 3 feet past her, stopped, came back. The lobby went on around them. A rolling suitcase rattled past her left side. 2 women laughed about something near the elevators. The front desk phone rang and was answered. None of it reached the 40 feet between her and Taylor, which had somehow developed its own weather. He walked toward her. She didn't move toward him. She genuinely couldn't have said whether that was a decision. He stopped closer than a stranger would, not as close as someone with standing. He looked at her the way people look when they're not entirely certain what they're seeing, quickly, thoroughly, with something at the edge of it that wasn't quite disbelief. Stella. Not a question. Her name said like a fact he was verifying. Taylor. She was distantly, specifically grateful that her voice came out even. He started to say something, and then didn't. His jaw shifted. You look... A pause, a redirect. It's been a long time. 16 months. Something crossed his face at the precision. You counted. I'm good with numbers when it matters. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then, not rudely, not obviously, just a slight drop in his focus. His eyes moved to Liam, who was on her chest in the carrier, facing outward, currently absorbed in the chandelier above them, with the solemn concentration he brought to all interesting overhead objects. The silence after that was a different kind than any of the others. Taylor's expression did something she couldn't name cleanly. Not shock, something slower than shock, more structural. The look of a man who had been certain of the ground beneath him and had just felt it shift. He looked at Liam the way you look at something that requires a moment to fully resolve. The dark eyes, the set of his brow, the particular way he was put together, still small, still entirely baby, but already and unmistakably himself. She watched Taylor see it, watched the moment it stopped being ambiguous. How old is he? The careful quality in his voice was new. Something had changed registers. 7 months. He did the math. She could see it, a brief involuntary recalculation moving through his expression, landing. He looked back up at her. Stella? I know. Not harsh, just ahead of him. Is he? Yes. One word. It sat between them with the weight of everything it contained. Liam had lost interest in the chandelier and was now studying Taylor with the frank, borderline rude assessment of someone who had not yet been socialized out of staring. His small hand had found the edge of the carrier strap and was holding it. He made a sound. Not a word yet, not quite, but pointed in Taylor's direction in a way that was hard to interpret as anything other than deliberate. Taylor made a sound back, low, unplanned, the kind that doesn't clear through the brain before it arrives. There are things I need to tell you. Stella kept her voice steady. She'd been gripping her laptop bag strap without noticing, and she made herself loosen her hand. About why I didn't reach out, and about what happened the one time I did. His eyes sharpened. You called. Once? 6 weeks after California. She didn't look away. A woman answered. She watched him take that in, not just the fact, but the whole shape of it. What she must have heard and how it must have landed and what she'd decided to do alone, with the consequence of that phone call growing inside her. Ashley. The name came out flat and cold, like something he'd been waiting to have reason to say. She told me it was your wedding day. The pause that followed had weight and texture, and went on long enough that a family with luggage walked directly between them, and neither of them moved. It wasn't. He said it with the deliberate care of someone who understood that those 2 words were nowhere near sufficient, and was saying them anyway because they were true, and had to be said first. I need you to hear that. Whatever she told you, we weren't together, there was no wedding, she was never... He stopped. His fingers came up briefly to his mouth, pressing there for a second. A gesture she'd never seen from him in California, a crack in the composure she'd never seen crack. And that small involuntary thing told her more than the words had. She had a key to my apartment. I didn't know she had my phone. I didn't know any of it until after. There was no wedding, Stella. She looked at him, held it long enough to be sure she was reading what was actually there and not what she wanted to find. I need to know everything, she said. Not the summary. All of it. You'll get it. One nod. Steady. All of it. Liam's arm extended toward Taylor, that open-handed reaching that babies do, indiscriminate and absolute, meaning everything and nothing at once. Neither of them spoke. He came to Portland 12 days after Seattle. No long preamble, no negotiation. Just a text on the Friday. I'd like to see him. And you, if that's something you'd consider. She read it twice, put the phone face down on the counter, made tea she didn't drink, picked the phone up again. Then she called Rosa and told her everything, the whole story, start to finish, for the first time. Rosa listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, without the small sounds people make to signal they're still there. And when Stella finally stopped talking, Rosa didn't say what should you do, or what makes sense, or any of the things people say when they want to seem helpful without taking a position. She said, "What do you want?" Stella thought about that for 2 days. Sunday, 2 hours. There's a park near my apartment. He arrived on time. Not 5 minutes early, which would have felt like pressure, like someone trying to demonstrate something before the thing had even started. Not a few minutes late in that careless, habitual way she remembered from California, the way of someone accustomed to rooms waiting for him. On time, exactly, which told her he'd thought about what on time meant in this specific context and had done it deliberately. She noticed. She didn't say so. The park was her river path, the same one she'd walked through all 9 months, first at a pace and then at something considerably more modest. November had stripped it back, bare branches, the grass gone dull, the water below flat and the colour of old pewter. She was already there when he came down the path, Liam in the stroller, coffee in her hand that she was holding mostly for the warmth of it. Taylor had his hands in his jacket pockets and stopped a few feet away with the careful restraint of a man containing something larger than what he was showing. "Hi," he said. "Hi." He looked at Liam. Liam looked back, that sober, measuring expression he'd developed around 8 months that Rosa had started calling the audit, delivered to strangers and new situations with equal impartiality. Taylor didn't wait to be invited. He just crouched down to stroller level, which Stella filed away without making anything of it yet. "Hey," he said quietly. He stopped. Something in the sentence didn't finish right, and he let it go. "Hey." Liam considered him for a long beat, then shot his arm out and closed his entire fist around Taylor's index finger the way he grabbed everything, completely, without reservation, and Taylor went still in a way that had nothing to do with staying calm. They walked for an hour. She'd said 2 and she watched the time, not because she was waiting for him to leave, but because the limit was the point. She was not the same person who had made herself small and available and arranged herself around other people's schedules. The boundary wasn't punishment, it was just true. He told her about Ashley while they stood at the railing along the river. All of it, the way she'd asked for in Seattle. Jan X, not serious in the way he'd allowed it to not be serious, someone who'd had access to his apartment, his life, in the casual and unconsidered way he'd allowed people access to things without examining why. She'd been there when he came back to the city weeks after Carmel. He'd been in the shower. She'd had his phone. He hadn't known until days later, when he found a deleted call in his log from an unfamiliar number and called it back. Already disconnected. Stella had changed it by then. "I tried to find you," he said. The water moved below them, grey and unhurried. "I didn't have your last name. I knew publishing Chicago that you'd come from New York." A pause. "That's not enough to find someone." "No," Stella said. "I should have asked." "Yes." He didn't follow that with an explanation or a defense, or the kind of elaboration people reach for when they're more interested in being absolved than in being accountable. He just stood with it. Absorbed it the same way she'd watched him absorb things in Carmel, without flinching, without trying to redistribute the weight somewhere else. She'd been testing for exactly that without consciously deciding to. The visits settled into a rhythm. 2 weeks after the first, then weekly, then sometimes twice when his schedule placed him near Portland, which happened with a frequency she tracked without remarking on. He never asked for more time than she'd offered. Never arrived with the energy of someone about to negotiate the terms. Once he showed up with 2 coffees, her order, which she'd never given him. She raised an eyebrow. He said he'd guessed. She looked at the cup, and it was right, the specific right, oat milk and 1 shot of vanilla. And she said nothing about it, but she thought about it that night after Liam was asleep, sitting in her kitchen in the quiet. That was the other thing she was watching. Not the gestures. The gestures were easy to perform. She was watching what happened in the gaps between them, whether he was present when nothing was required of him, whether he could simply be in a room that wasn't asking anything of him and stay. He could. By the third visit, Liam had issued his own verdict. He lunged toward Taylor when the door opened with a whole-body enthusiasm he otherwise reserved for Rosa, his stuffed elephant, and the specific drawer in the kitchen where the crackers lived. Taylor was not theatrical about it. He didn't perform delight. He just got down on the floor and let himself be used as a climbing structure, and stayed there for as long as was needed. And the absence of performance was what made Stella trust it more than anything else could have. In December, on a Tuesday evening, he stayed for dinner. It hadn't been planned. Liam had fallen asleep mid-story, with his face pressed against Taylor's shoulder, and neither of them had been willing to end whatever that was, and one practical consideration had led to another. And she'd put Liam down and come back to the kitchen and made pasta, because it was what she had. They'd eaten it at her small table by the window, the city outside going dark and quiet, and it had been so ordinary that she hadn't known what to do with it. The kind of ordinary she'd quietly stopped letting herself picture. "You're different," Taylor said. He was drying a bowl she'd handed him. She looked over from the sink. "Different how?" He took a moment, the real kind, not a conversational pause. "Settled, like you know where your feet are." He turned the bowl over once in his hands. "You didn't have that in California." "I didn't know where anything was in California." "Neither did I." He set the bowl down. "For a long time before that, actually." She turned off the tap, dried her hands on the dish towel, and looked at him across the narrow kitchen. This man who had been showing up at her door for 4 months, with the consistency of someone who had decided something and was simply enacting the decision, without drama, without requiring acknowledgement. She had things she could have said. A few of them were true and important. She said, "Same time Sunday?" He nodded, picked up his jacket from the chair. At the door he stopped and turned, and the hallway light caught the angle of his face, and for just a moment it was Carmel again. That specific pressure of a thing that existed between them and had no name yet. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Not performed, not shaped into something quotable. Just said, in the tone of someone stating a present fact they intended to keep being true. She looked at him. "I know," she said. She almost did. She closed the door and stood in the hallway and listened to his footsteps go down the stairs, steady, unhurried, not the steps of someone leaving but of someone who'd be back. And she thought about how the distance between almost and certain had never been something you could think your way across. It was made of Sundays, accumulated ordinary unremarkable Sundays, each one doing its small silent work. There was no single moment. That was the thing Stella couldn't explain when people asked, and people did ask eventually, the way they always do when a story ends somewhere surprising. How did it happen? When did you know? And she never had the clean answer they were looking for, because there wasn't one. It wasn't a moment. It was February becoming March. It was Sunday visits becoming Tuesday evenings, becoming the unremarkable domestic fact of Taylor already being there when she came home, Liam on his hip, something on the stove, the particular sound of a person who belongs in a space moving through it without thinking about whether they do. It was small things accumulated, the kind that mean nothing individually and everything in sequence. She stopped keeping track at some point. She didn't register when. In March, he asked if he could leave some things at her place. He was deliberate about the phrasing. Some things not move in, the precise language of a man who understood the difference and wasn't going to blur it without permission. A change of clothes, he said, so he didn't have to drive home at midnight every time. She stood in her hallway and looked at him and thought about everything the question contained and said yes, and that was the whole conversation. 2 weeks later, there was a second toothbrush, a jacket on the hook by the door, that hook the one that had been bare since the night she'd taken Daniel's keys down and put them in the kitchen drawer and not looked back. And Liam, who had been conducting his own separate assessment this whole time, began reaching for Taylor first thing every morning, the way he reached for things he was certain of. Arms up, no question in it. The unguarded confidence of someone who has never been given a reason to brace. Stella watched that and felt something she didn't have language for yet. She left it unnamed and let it keep growing. Spring that year came the way it always does in Portland. Not a single day you could point to. Just grey becoming incrementally less grey until one morning you looked out the window and noticed it was green, and couldn't say when it had happened. She was happy. She noticed that the same way, not as an event, but as the slow recognition that the weight she'd been carrying for 2 years was gone and had been gone for a while, and she'd just been so accustomed to it that its absence had taken time to register. Taylor had changed. She could see it clearly in some ways and couldn't name it in others. The clearest thing was the simplest. He stayed. Not as a performance of staying, not with the self-conscious effort of someone demonstrating a quality they want credit for, just as a daily, unremarkable fact, the way people inhabit lives they've actually chosen. He handled uncertainty better than she'd expected, better than she did sometimes. The ordinary friction of a shared life, the schedule conflicts, the tired evenings, the nights when Liam was impossible and neither of them had anything left. He moved through all of it without looking for an exit, without even, as far as she could tell, wanting one. That was the thing she hadn't been sure she'd believe until she saw it enough times to stop checking. One evening in April she was on the couch with a manuscript. Liam long asleep, Taylor at the kitchen table with his laptop. The low, particular sound of someone actually working, keystrokes and pauses, and one quiet exhale when something didn't land right. She looked up from her pages for no reason, just looked at him, and the thought arrived without ceremony, no build-up, nothing to announce it. I love this person. Not the version she'd been carefully managing for months, the feeling with all its asterisks and conditions and protective hedges. Just that. Plain and settled, and already true for longer than she was admitting. She looked back at her manuscript. She didn't say it that night. She held it for 3 more weeks, turning it over, not doubting it exactly, but not quite ready to make it real by saying it out loud. Then on a Sunday morning, Liam in his high chair, Taylor making coffee, the late winter light coming through the west window in that particular way it had, the same angle that had made her sign the lease, the light that had felt like a promise. It just came out. I love you. He turned from the counter. The look on his face was not surprise. It was closer to the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time and has just been released from it. Something loosened in him, visibly. I know, he said. Then quieter, working something out. I love you too. It's been a while that I've... He stopped, looked slightly annoyed at himself for fumbling it. Yeah. Liam hit both palms flat on his tray with the authority of someone closing a meeting. They got married in January. 30 people. A restaurant 3 blocks from the apartment. The one with the good afternoon light and chairs that didn't match, and a menu handwritten on a chalkboard above the bar. Rosa, who had been there for most of it. Marcus from the press, who gave a toast that was unexpectedly funny and then looked surprised that it was. Stella's sister, who started crying in the car on the way there and maintained that state with impressive consistency throughout the day. Taylor's brother, who was similar enough in build and colouring that Liam kept lunging toward the wrong person and then finding the whole situation hilarious. It was not a flawless day. The flowers were off. Some miscommunication about colour, something too pale, something Rosa clocked immediately, and Stella didn't notice until the photos. Taylor's vows went long. Not a little long. Genuinely, warmly, self-awarely long. And somewhere around the 4th minute Stella laughed, a real laugh she didn't plan, and he lost his place entirely, and the room fell apart in the best way. The officiant had to wait. It was better for all of it. It was theirs in all the specific, imperfect ways that things are yours. That night in the hotel 2 blocks away, she lay looking at the ceiling while the day settled around her like something finally at rest. Not a weight, the opposite. You okay? Taylor was on his side, watching her in the dark the way he did. Yeah. She turned toward him. More than. He was quiet a moment. I kept thinking about Monterey today. That cafe. The table you took. The table I shared. You sat down without asking. You stayed, he said simply. She had. She'd stayed and run and come back and been found and lost herself again and rebuilt from whatever was left. And now she was here, in this room, in this marriage, in this body that had done the impossible once already and was, she now knew for certain, doing it again. 6 weeks certain. She'd been carrying the knowledge for 3 of them, waiting for the right moment, turning it over, not ready. Lying in the dark on her wedding night, it occurred to her that waiting for the right moment was a very old habit, the kind that belonged to the version of her who was always living slightly ahead of herself, always in the next moment, always preparing. Taylor. There's something I need to tell you. He went still in that particular way. Not alarmed, just completely present, all of his attention arriving at once. Okay. She shifted to face him. In the low light, she could see the familiar line of his jaw, the way he looked when he wasn't performing anything, when it was just him and whatever was in front of him. I'm pregnant. The silence lasted long enough to have texture. Then his hand came to her face, palm settling against her cheek, thumb moving once unhurried, and he looked at her without speaking, and she felt the warmth of his hand in the dark, and thought about that first morning in Carmel, the light off the Pacific. How lost she had been without knowing it yet. How far she was from that now. Yeah? Low. Something unsteady in it she'd never heard before. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. Then, no fear this time. Not a question. Just the 2 of them agreeing on something. No fear, she said. He pulled her in and she let herself be held, completely, without the old reflex of staying slightly separate, staying ready to leave. The city outside moved through its nighttime sounds. Somewhere below, a car, a door. The ordinary life of a place that had no idea what was happening 2 floors up. She pressed her face against his chest. His heartbeat was steady and slow and entirely unbothered, and she thought about how love doesn't arrive on the schedule you draw up for it. It doesn't come because you wanted it enough, or because you did everything correctly, or because you held on through all the hardest parts and therefore earned it. It comes when the hardest parts have changed you into someone who can actually hold it. When you've stood in the wreckage of what you planned and chosen, without guarantees, to stay open. When you're ready, not to need someone, to let them stay. She closed her eyes. Outside, the city breathed, and in the particular warmth and quiet of that room, without ceremony or announcement, the rest of their lives simply continued. She had wanted a child. She had wanted to be loved. She had wanted more than anything to stop being afraid of both. She got all 3, not when she planned, not how she planned, not without loss and wreckage and the particular courage of someone who keeps going anyway. Some things don't arrive. They find you when you finally stop running from what you deserve. If this story moved something in you, subscribe, leave your like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. You being here is what keeps these stories alive.